Hello there. In this video, I'm going to be analyzing an argument for a flat tax that I call the equality argument. Now, a flat tax is a tax in which everyone pays the exact same percentage of their income, no matter how much or little they make. And this sort of argument is typically given for a flat tax against a progressive tax, which is a tax in which the more money you make, the higher a percentage of your income you pay. Now, I'm going to be arguing that the equality argument fails. In other words, it fails to justify the conclusion that we should have a flat tax. And the reason is it relies on a premise which might strike you as plausible at first, but we've actually got no good reason to accept it once we notice that there are some alternative premises which lead to different conclusions which are equally plausible, if not more plausible. Now, this sort of argument is typically given by libertarian-leaning people. I've heard it expressed to me in person, and I've also seen it expressed on the internet. There was a presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party who went on the Rubin Report a couple of years ago, and he made this argument. Sometimes this argument is stated in terms of fairness rather than equality, but I'm going to consider the version based on equality. All right? So, let's get to the argument. The equality argument for a flat tax. Premise 1, tax policy should treat people equally. Conclusion, so people should be taxed at the same rate. Now, this sort of argument might strike you as convincing, but one thing you should notice is it's not actually a valid argument as stated. Okay, it's invalid. In other words, the premises don't, or the one premise does not entail the conclusion. This conclusion does not follow from this premise alone. Now, if we're being charitable, I think we have to say that there's clearly a suppressed premise here. So let's see if we can make that premise explicit so we can see whether we have a good reason to accept it. So this brings us to equality argument F, F for flat tax. Premise 1, tax policy should treat people equally. Premise 2, tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed at the same rate or at an equal percentage of their income. Conclusion, so people should be taxed at the same rate. All right, so now we have a valid argument. The premises entail the conclusion. The question is, should we accept these premises? Well, let's briefly take a look at the first premise here. Tax policy should treat people equally. It's a fairly plausible premise, right? But there are a couple ways you might challenge it. You might say treating people equally is one consideration that's relevant to designing tax policy, but there might be some other morally relevant considerations. For instance, maybe we want a tax policy that benefits the worst off in our society. Maybe we want a tax policy that makes our society as a whole as well off as possible. There might be some other considerations that are relevant. So there might be some trade-offs that suggest that treating people equally isn't the only thing we need to be concerned with when designing tax policy. However, I'm not going to be challenging the first premise in this video. Okay, I'm going to grant the first premise, and what I want to focus on is this second premise. Tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed at the same rate. All right, so let's just get an example on the table so that we can think more concretely about this. All right, so same rate, let's say 5% of one's income. Bob makes 30K, so he's going to pay 1.5K. Sally makes 30 million, she's going to pay 1.5 million. Right? So again, the second premise says tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed at the same rate. Might sound plausible on the face of it, but I think it can be challenged. And the way we're going to challenge it is we're going to point out that this is not the only conceivable way that tax policy might treat people equally. There are actually some other conceivable ways that might treat that tax policy might treat people equally. So to consider these, I want you to look at an alternative equality argument. This one's called equality argument H for a head tax. Okay? A head tax is a tax in which everyone pays the exact same dollar amount. It's a uniform tax on all people. All right? So premise 1, tax policy should treat people equally. Premise 2, Tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed the same dollar amount. Conclusion, so people should be taxed the same dollar amount, right? So this argument's valid. It shares the same first premise as our other equality argument. It has a different conclusion, and that's because the second premise is different, right? So what does this second premise say? Tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed the same dollar amount. So what this shows is that taxing people at the same rate is not the only conceivable way that tax policy might treat people equally. Taxing them the exact same dollar amount is another conceivable way. And let's just get an example on the table, right? So let's say that we have a head tax of 1.5K on all people. So Bob makes 30K, he pays 1.5K. Sally makes 30 million, but she pays the same dollar amount, 1.5K. So once we see that this sort of argument is another conceivable argument, then we have to ask ourselves, do we have any good reason to favor the second premise of the original equality argument for a flat tax over the second premise of this argument? Now, before we say more about that, let's get one more equality argument on the table. All right. So this is equality argument P, and this one is for a progressive tax. Premise 1, tax policy should treat people equally. Premise 2, tax policy treats people equally only if people bear an equal tax burden. I'll explain that in 1 second. Conclusion, so people should bear an equal tax burden. Right? So a person bears a greater tax burden to the extent that they are hurt more by taxes, to the extent that they get more disutility from having to pay taxes. Right? So consider this, a poor person gets hurt much more by losing $100 than Bill Gates does, right? Because money has diminishing marginal utility. A poor person who would spend a significant portion of their money on essential items is going to get hurt very badly by losing $100. But Bill Gates is barely going to feel it, if he feels it at all, right? I mean, losing $100 to Bill Gates is akin to someone bumping into him on the street. In fact, he's arguably hurt even less by losing $100 than he is by someone bumping into him on the street. Okay? So, the same tax burden, a tax proposal which attempts to make people bear the exact same tax burden, is going to result in a progressive tax. And to see that, let's look at our example again. Right? Bob makes 30K, and let's say he pays 1.5K, 5% of his income. Now, Sally makes 30 million. So let's think about how much she would have to pay in order for her to bear an equal tax burden to the one that Bob bears. Well, Bob, making 30K, is paying 1.5K. And that's a highly significant amount to someone making 30K. Right? Again, someone making only 30K is spending a significant portion of their money on essential items. And so losing 1.5K is going to be a significant blow to their life. That's going to be a huge cost to them. So clearly, Sally, who makes 30 million, is going to have to pay much, much more than 5% of her income. Much, much more than 1.5 million. Since 1.5 million, losing that is not going to hurt her very much. Right? She still has 28.5 million. She's very comfortable with that. So whatever number we eventually come up with, right? Whatever amount of money makes it so that she bears an equal tax burden, it's quite obvious it's going to be much, much greater than 1.5 million. Hence, she's going to have to pay a much larger percentage of her income than Bob pays. And so that's why we result with in a progressive tax on this proposal. Okay, so now that we have these equality arguments out on the table, let's compare them. Okay, they all share the same first premise. Tax policy should treat people equally. So in order to compare them, let's compare their second premises. That's where they differ to lead to a different conclusion. Right? So here is the second premise of each argument. H2, tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed the same dollar amount. This is for the head tax. F2, tax policy treats people equally only if people are taxed at the same rate. Right? That's your flat tax premise. And then P2, tax policy treats people equally only if people bear an equal tax burden. And that's the premise in the argument for a progressive tax. So we have to ask ourselves, which second premise here is the most plausible. H2, F2, or P2. In other words, what is the relevant thing to equalize? Dollar amount, percentage of income, or tax burden? Right? Now, in order for the equality argument for a flat tax to succeed, we need a good reason to support premise F2 over the alternatives, right? So do we have any good reason to favor F2 over H2 or P2, right? Why is it that the percentage of income is a relevant thing to equalize rather than the dollar amount or the tax burden? If the argument for a flat tax can't justify that second premise because there are these alternative premises, well, then it fails to justify its conclusion. And so I think what putting these arguments side by side makes clear is that the flat taxer, the person who supports a flat tax on the basis of the equality argument, is in a very uncomfortable position, because any argument that the flat taxer gives to the progressive taxer, right, the head taxer can make against the flat taxer. And any response that the flat taxer gives to the head taxer can be made by the progressive taxer to the flat taxer, right? So for instance, the flat taxer says to the progressive taxer, hey, your proposal is unfair. It's making Sally pay a higher percentage of her income than Bob, so you're not treating people equally. But notice the head taxer can turn to the flat taxer and say, hey, flat taxer, your proposal is making Sally pay a higher dollar amount than Bob, right? Bob, who makes 30K, is on the flat tax paying 1.5K. Sally, who makes 30 million on the flat tax, is paying 1.5 million. She's paying 1,000 times the dollar amount that Bob is paying. So the head taxer would claim that the flat taxer is not treating people equally. Now, how might the flat taxer respond to the head taxer? The flat taxer might say something like, hey, head taxer, I admire your striving for equality in tax policy, but your proposal simply won't work. Whatever head tax we propose, it has to be low enough so that even the poorest can afford it, and any such head tax won't be capable of funding the government programs that we want. But notice the progressive taxer can make the exact same response to the flat taxer. Hey, flat taxer, I admire your striving for equality in tax policy, but the flat tax that you want simply won't be able to fund the government programs that we want, right? It's the same style of response to the flat taxer that the flat taxer is making to the head taxer. Now, even more than that, the progressive taxer can make the exact same argument against the flat taxer that the flat taxer is making against the progressive taxer, right? The progressive taxer can say, hey, flat taxer, you're making people pay an equal percentage of their income. So you're making Bob, who makes 30K, pay 1.5K, and you're making Sally, who makes 30 million, pay 1.5 million. But that 1.5K is a much, much larger burden on Bob than the 1.5 million is a burden on Sally, right? So you're not actually treating people equally. You're making the poor person, Bob, bear a much, much larger tax burden. So again, the central question comes to, what is the relevant thing to equalize? Is it the dollar amount each person's paying? Is it the percentage of their income they're paying? Or is it the tax burden they bear, the extent to which they're hurt by taxes? Now, in my own view, it seems like the premise P2 is the most plausible out of these three. In other words, the burden that taxes are on you, that seems like the most morally relevant thing to equalize insofar as we want tax policy to treat people equally. The having people pay the same dollar amount or the same percentage of their income seems just arbitrary versus the extent to which they are hurt by taxes. I won't argue with that. I won't argue that at length. The important thing is, I think, the equality argument for a flat tax, right? Equality argument F, fails to justify its conclusion because its second premise isn't justified. We've got no good reason to take the percentage of one's income to be the relevant thing to equalize over the dollar amount or over the burden that taxes are on them. But if you think I'm wrong, right, if you think you can justify why the percentage of one's income is the relevant thing that we want to equalize, insofar as we want tax policy to treat people equally, then I guess I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.